um, sort of break us right through into the discussion on India. But since we are starting to talk about countries a little bit more from their past, to understand the present and the trajectory for the near future, there are specific, I think, texts that give you a reference for how other countries with a similar, or if not a similar, but at least sort of tangentially similar colonial past have shaped their own journeys through. So if you'd remember in the last session, let me just, for example, just a second, check my screen. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So this is the taxonomy that we were looking at in the last session. I want to just sort of very briefly ask if there were any specific queries with respect to your understanding of these. Let me ask by distinguishing between what are interpreted as proximate and deeper determinants to economic growth. Um, the emphasis of growth, as I was speaking earlier, was central to much of macroeconomic policy discussions, which gave way to conversations around the emergence of development economics. The origins of development economics were more or less, I think, concentrated on questions of distribution, proportionality, the effects of testing, which was in the US 1980s under Reagan, this concept of trickle down growth and trickle down economics. So those aspects were being deeply questioned by scholars, and which led for a lot of people, not just economists, but political scientists and sociologists to have some offering in terms of expanding the purview of economics, of growth measurement to include the deeper determinants of growth. And this is where institutions, the level or the degree of integration of an economy with the rest of the world or within the region, and the role of geography became integral. So I just wanted to cross-check once if this taxonomy is clear to everyone. And if there are any questions, I think this would be a good sort of time to ask or reflect. Okay, so if we are good, let me, yeah, the terms endogeneity and exogeneity, right? So if you remember, I was talking about these in reference to saying that their perspectives in the way growth measurement or in any way, any variables can be studied. If you talk about endogeneity, it looks in principle things that are internal to the process of something. Exogenous tends to look at what would be seen as something which is external to the process. In many cases, exogenous variables are somewhere outside your control. There's not much that you can do about it. I mean, so one of the common areas in econ that the term exogenous comes to studies in cases of studying crises, where you talk about exogenous shocks. So, I mean, for example, we were talking about Trump a lot in the last session. So tariffs, imposition of tariffs. Now, things that are coming to a given country, like, I mean, in the case of, for example, Brazil, last 48 hours, Brazil has been sort of targeted on multiple fronts based on tariff-based sort of restrictions from the US. Now, in the Brazilian context, it would be deemed as an exogenous shock. The policy measure of imposing tariffs on US exports is not something that its own administration is processing. At the same time, the endogenous perspective would argue to look at the nature of impact of that shock on the internal process of growth. So if you have a situation where the trade of goods and services which were otherwise directed to the US sort of result in a sort of adversarial impact on the industry of those goods and services, and they are leading to loss of jobs, that would have a serious impact on the internal process of growth within Brazil for those sectors. So these are perspectives. I mean, endogeneity and exogeneity tend to sort of be often studied as ways of reasoning and ways of thinking, Econ. The term partly endogenous, I hope, was clear, where the role or effect on process or outcomes is not entirely driven by just internal or just entirely external circumstances. So trade is something which has things attached both ways. The actions of another party will affect in some way what you intend to do. And in a similar context, institutions too, with a more integrated word, tend to work under what countries do as a result of what other countries do, or at the same time, uh, the role of international institutions, international law shape or direct reform in many cases within countries. And those are seen as effects that are external but still have an internal effect. So that's why the term partly endogenous is used. So if there are no questions in here, I want to sort of move on with the second part of the text, if you remember, which was talking about statements. And I want to sort of ask for reflections from each one of you based on what you understood. Just a second. Which is, if you remember the second part of the reading that you were looking at, which was dealing with the point on questions. Yes? And there were some answers from cross-country narratives that were brought into the purview of a discussion. So let's start with, let's say, the first point. And I mean, this is where each one of you would have to sort of step in and think on examples that I'd asked you to sort of look at. It could be from an example you were already studying or from the text. So answers emerging from different cross-country narratives or stories or aspects. Before that, just, I mean, why do you, I mean, I have been emphasizing on this, but in your assessment, do you relate to the fact that a more narrative, context-dependent focus on studying growth or development trajectories matter? Because if everything is so subjectively linked and is so context dependent, how do answers from different country narratives help you ascertain anything or understand anything? I mean, I know I'm emphasizing on that, but I want to know what is your view on this. I mean, to some people, the argument for studying economics has been to determine what would be seen, much like physics, as some kind of universally determined answers to cause and effect relationships, where variables and data is collected cross panel, across time and space, and you try to come up with answers which help, let's say, not one country but another set of countries also deal with the same question. And now we are talking about a completely different sort of space where we are arguing that no, well, we need to look at in what context what response works. You may have a very strong correlation between rising prices and climate change, and that may be universally determined. But it may happen that, oh, price rise is not happening as a result of climate change as a big factor in one country, and the degrees of that may be completely different in another country. So context dependent analysis matters. So we need to talk about each country as its own story, and there you go in sort of talking about a different analytical framework. But in your view, as students who are trying to maybe, I would say, study international development, to what extent do country narratives matter, or narrativizing as an effect of sort of studying countries is critical or important, or is it? Hmm. Okay. Let me- Okay, today I'm gonna sort of start asking people to speak up a little bit. Okay, Carl, Peter, Rejma, any reflections? You could just raise your hand and answer. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Yes, Charlie.
I think I would say, one thing we've learned in this program is how development sort of evolved out of a concept of one size fits all, and that we've seen throughout the last half century that that's just not the case. It can't be. So I think country narratives are really important in order to move development away from this sort of ideology that there are either quick fixes or there are universal fixes, and allows each country to kind of understand the complexity of its own situation, whether that's colonialism or sort of the misuse of its resources or whatever it is. I think that you need the narratives to really to get in to see the forest for the trees. Otherwise, you're just perpetuating this one size fits all problem.
Yeah, fair enough. And so the same question applies then to the fact that if you want to look at each case as its own merit, then what is so international about the aspect of studying it? I mean, the point is that if we have to look at things from a very granular, microcosmic space, where you're trying to study, I mean, are there common uh, areas of study that are universally valuable or of interest to development concerns? And the process of studying that is more or less being done now in a context dependent manner. So what value is that? Is that analytical processes? So I understand the critique of that, which is why you need it, because there's no one size fits all solution. But what's the value in this?
I think I would say that the value allows for the space for new voices and new perspectives, because again, it allows for kind of the power dynamics to shift to a more local context, and allows for people sort of in that new solutions and new narratives that are otherwise or can be very easily over, local knowledge, local solutions. And I think in making country narratives a priority, you're able to create a space for people to, for it to go to the local level. But I also think that there are overarching themes, especially in, whether it's countries that have experienced similar types of colonialism or have similar histories to an extent or similar present. I think that you can definitely find, there are definitely trends, and there are definitely spaces where one approach will be able to be utilized in another situation, and also spaces where you can say this didn't work, and how do we, in a similar situation, where do we find an alternative?
Fair enough. Okay. Shiana?
Yes, I'd say that country narratives are important because they show the history, the culture, and also the politics of how the development was shaped. But it also helps us understand development beyond just numbers, and also like reveals the challenges and the strengths unique to each countries and their development.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think somewhere it's important to understand or acknowledge that fields such as the one that we are all sort of studying, whether it's international development, political economy, um, international relations, international law, are things that transcend the boundaries geographically speaking of any given sort of space. One of the major uh, objectives of these fields is to help you understand the positionality or positions of countries in their own independent but yet entwined or interconnected contexts. I think both are in sort of weight of importance equally relevant. If you're learning an example of how malaria as a disease was eradicated in less than 10 years in Bhutan, and how very similar, exactly the same efforts were made in the northeastern state of India, Assam, but with no actual realizable gains. What a field like international development can do is learn from the Bhutan example. What was the processes of working towards malaria eradication using the insights or the case of that particular country, while looking at what didn't work in Assam, and both share almost the same border in that part of the region, and try to assess and relate to the fact on how you can understand through country or very localized examples of what works, what doesn't work, and what better can you do or improve upon existing processes. It's actually very difficult to comment on each country's own merit or value, and there is an exercise. I mean, in anthropology, the term which is often used is cultural relativism. Like, you have to avoid mapping. I mean, you want to avoid comparing cultures and sort of pegging what's sort of being interpreted as better or worse. You have to give sort of equal weight of importance um, in studying that, at least. So the Bhutanese case might give certain reference points for India to sort of draw its examples for. And at the same time, India would have certain things which the Bhutanese case can sort of draw its lessons from. What you are trying to do is give a lot of importance to localized narratives without assuming that there is, as Charlie mentioned, one size fits all solution possible. So these objectives are mutually interdependent, and what you would find maybe today with the cases of examples that some of you would look at um, is that even in the context of colonialism, the experience of colonialism is so varied and differed across different spaces or even within countries that you find it difficult to uh, somewhere relate how colonial pasts can be interpreted with different stories of what people know about their past, right? For some people, the acknowledgement of a colonial past is almost treated as a matter of celebration. I mean, in Canada, you have a number of days still earmarked which have sort of the genesis of reasoning and going back to celebrating victories of almost a colonial past, which is still pretty much accepted. At the same time, in the Indian context or in the Nigerian context, the same episode of a British victory or a British sort of Raj intervention would be not a subject of celebration, but more of, I mean, if not at least resentment, a degree of deniability of what you want to sort of avoid. You can't completely um, forget that there are certain episodes in the past which led to extractive institutions being developed, and the effect of those were very clearly there to be realized. So in such scenarios, what happens is that what you're trying to do is fundamentally is to understand what is happening in context to the historical scenarios of each country's past. You do need local narratives, definitely, but somewhere you also need an exercise to take a bird's eye view of positions and situations. And sometimes I think this is a process which is self-contradictory, almost self-contradictory nature, because you're trying to go from a bird's eye view to a very localized, granular perspective building a context dependent scenario. And then you have to take an abstract view on things. All right. So if you're looking at public health, we are looking at climate change. If you're looking at securitization, um, there are certain issues, human rights, you will need to have common principles, which are shared principles and values where other countries can sort of find common ground to work together. I think that's more important now than perhaps ever before. The only period I can think back is the 1940s, about the end of Second World War, where countries almost felt the need, were compelled to come together and think of multilateral or international institutions. They're very, very few of those institutions that still have that amount of reckoning where countries find a reason to come together and cooperate on issues. And that's, I think that the overemphasis of context and the overemphasis of localized narratives without taking the abstract view at things somewhere gives also way to a very nativist, tribalist, agenda. And somewhere I think that's where a lot of the political shift of the rise of what is being defined as right wing populist behavior, or in the past what you could see with the left wing populist behavior. I mean, the extremities of these underdetermined nationalistic tendencies for countries to sort of overemphasize on the local as against on compromising on global principles is it's in somewhere its own cause of concern. So I think these aspects are very critical. So what we are going to do here is, and I'm going to what sorry, my classes today are waving up. I think there is the role of narratives in sort of looking at late development scenarios, which are very critical. I mean, one or the sort of set of questions that you see here, which are very critical to value or understand, is with respect to, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So the cases of countries that one would look at, which are seen as late developing nation states, you would see that there is a context of looking at their colonial pasts, which help you to understand the origins of their economic growth trajectory, or the model of development that they were able to follow. That helps you give a narrative based assessment or a framework of analysis. That framework is born and drawn from the taxonomy that we were looking at. The third element of, as a part of a question that one can frame, is on the role of importance of studying changing narratives in the sort of diagnosis of economic reasoning and policy experimentation. The third question is of a great intellectual interest to me. I think there are very few scholars who've made a conscious effort to understand how narratives and change in narratives affect economic reasoning as well. Just because something happened and as a result of a study undertaken 10 years back in a policy case example that worked, doesn't mean that if you would apply under the same conditions now, the same set of outcomes can be achieved. And one of the classic case of point is in, let's say, to give you an example, is microfinance. Right now in the 90s, you had a scenario where in rural areas, particularly in emerging markets where access to formal credit was limited, you had a scenario where countries were being given a lot of importance to encourage microfinance interventions as what countries that were having successful examples. I mean, in the South Asian context, Bangladesh or Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on developing microfinance institutions, was heralded as the sort of champion of ensuring access to credit in the most sort of vulnerable of areas for communities that needed credit for growth and upward mobility purposes. Now, the evidence on microfinance is extremely different, and it's mixed. There are scenarios where interventions on microfinance institutional development have clearly not worked. They've, in fact, on the contrary, made communities more vulnerable to debt. And that has impacted them in the worst possible way. You have scenarios where, yes, in some cases, certain practices of developing microfinance institutions have worked, but with again, very marginal success. So the evidence of just overarchingly developing microfinance institutions just because there were certain rural areas in Bangladesh that gave examples or were seen as beacons of rural development was misleading. And there was a tool for some of you who may or may not be aware, there was a tool which was often being studied in context to explaining this, which is the methodological tool of, has anybody heard of these before? So that is randomized controlled trials. It's a sort of methodological approach emerging from the testing of drugs and vaccines, biotech scenarios, and biology. RCTs are experiments in medical sciences that are often used, but they've been extended to apply as a method or tool in policy impact assessment scenarios in economics as well. And there are scholars who recently were given a Nobel Prize for their work on RCTs. And I'm just writing their names here so that you can look them up and be able to understand where they're coming from. And it was their work on RCTs which tried to sort of bring together a lot of intellectual wisdom or prudence. Okay, Francis says that we have, so that's great. So RCTs became a way to understand under what conditions, under what scenarios, which policy references or interventions work or don't work as a methodological tool. Now, there are a lot of issues with RCTs as well, but that's a subject for another discussion and debate. But at least they help you understand that, okay, if we are applying and developing the same set of institutions which were being done in rural Bangladesh, and then even contextually applying that in let's say rural India or rural Nigeria, you will not produce, of course, the same set of results, even if you look for context dependent scenarios, because some aspects of borrowing behavior pattern may be very different. And so you have to look at the case and study and do policy experiments before widespread implementation of that policy happens. So this third question is I think very critical in understanding that, which is how changing narratives of policy examples help you understand what happens in given scenarios. The other, I think, reference point is of a case, if I can just share that. It's now, I think, out as a book by this behavioral economist who also won a Nobel Prize. His name is Robert Schiller, and I'm just sharing his So, yeah, I'm just sharing his text. This, I think, was a text that came out a few years ago. The book's title is Narrative Economics, and this text aims to give you perspective through stories and how financial markets work. And what the word he uses as narrative economics helps you explain how there's a potential to improve our ability to predict and prepare or even lessen the damage of financial crises by knowing, how popular stories or narratives affect individual and, collective economic behavior. It's a fascinating text for anyone interested, and it's pretty easily has anybody read Schiller before under any course or any particular topic? No. I mean, if you would have done something in behavioral studies also, or psychology at the intersection of any discipline, he might be a name that might have flagged up. No. Okay. So yeah, so Robert Schiller, I mean, the one amazing thing about Robert Schiller and any of his books is they're very accessible, even to non-econ major students. And he might be talking about financial markets, but he does it in a manner that is reasonably well accessible. So the third question which I was raising is in very similar terms, that is on how we can include the importance of changing narratives, um, addressed as a central point of questions for Schiller in case of financial crisis as well. So keeping these questions at the backdrop and in mind, what I was hoping to do was to have around 2 or 3 smaller groups in the class created and looking at different cases of countries which help us get a perspective of their colonial past, and then try and to a certain extent assess what and to what extent their present growth trajectories are a product of that colonial past as well. So what we are going to do is the following. Let me first create a set of groups here, which will be helpful for anybody. Okay, so I need a yes to just get a confirmation if you're here. And then I think one of you, okay, I'm gonna ask someone to volunteer. Des, can you do this, please? Which is, if as I'm taking the names of people in different groups, you can just make a note of this and put them in the chat box so we know what is group 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay.
Okay, sure.
So group 1, Jonathan is here. Louise? So
Yes,
if you
I'm
can
here.
just, yes, yeah, yes, yes.
Yes.
Great. And Elisina. Okay. Yes. Okay. So group 1 would be Jonathan, Louise, Elisina. Group 2, Carl is here. Can get a yes. Carl, Marta, Mackenzie.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Okay. In fact, there are 3, 4 groups. Okay. Group 3, Peter, Francia, and Maripat. Can just say a yes, each one of you.
Yeah, I'm here. Francia is here.
Yeah, me too. Very bad. Mhm.
And that's group 3, right? Yeah. So we'll have a group 4, but we'll do the same as what we do in iteration as one of the other groups. So Asia, Charlie, Dora, and Des, right? So that can have 4 members. That's fine. All of you are here. That's fine. Anyone I
Here.
have missed out by chance? Yeah.
You've
Okay,
missed
Mary.
you've missed
Oh,
me,
Steph.
Professor.
Yeah. So group 5 would be okay. Group 3, let's just keep sorry, group 4, we'll keep 3 members. Des, I can put you with the team of Steph and Marilynus. Okay, so then it's all 3 each. So what are we doing here? We can just correct this, and then in the chat box, you know all which groups are you all part of. So there is a particular case that you will all look at, which is a sort of a colonial context of a country in focus. There are roughly 40 to 45 minutes given to each group, which is sort of on reading. And what you would want to do is basically get a perspective of what the text covers, at the same time understand, I mean, relate this in context to what we have been studying on growth trajectories. And you must have seen the cases of each of the countries that are mentioned on from the page 9 aspect, right? Geography is destiny, institutions matter. All of those aspects would sort of be better, I think, answered once you have cases in front of you to talk about. But in this case, what we are doing is we're looking back at the colonial past in larger sense. What are the cases, right? So these are the 3 cases that we're looking at. So group 1, 2, and 3 would look at these texts respectively. Group 4, I request you to look at the colonial origins of modern political economy, the text which group 2 is looking at as well. And group 5, right? Colonialism and development, British India. Okay, so if I'm correct, there are 5 groups, right? There's no 6th group. Now, the text, each of these texts are all there in the readings folder. The colonial origins of modern political economy, that reading, the group 2 reading, is within the chapter by Atul Kohli, his book. So you'll find that right there. Colonialism and Development, that is by Tirthankar Roy. And Tale of Two Dominions, again, that's a separate text as a journal article that you'd be able to get access to. Okay. So as a group, what you need to do is to be able to find critical observations from the text. What you could do is perhaps take the first 30 to 35 minutes for reading only, but then take the next at least 15 minutes as a group to sort of share your common points and have a short sort of a presentation, which helps one to understand the key observations that you were able to make from the text. Basically, a critical sort of a review of the author's arguments and observations, and that helps as a case for others to understand what you were reading. So it's a sort of a way for others to understand what the Australian and Canadian example helps you to understand for their colonial past vis-a-vis what you see in Japan and the Korean context. And then in that case of India and the British Empire. The British Empire period here, which you're looking at, is only one period, which is 1860 to 1920, which is when the power shifts from the East India Company to the Westminster sort of Queen rule in India. So that period is a marked difference from how things were prior to 1860, but it gives you a good sense nevertheless. So that's what we can start by looking at. If you have questions along the way, just type them in the chat box. I'll respond to those. Okay, what we'll do is we'll begin with your sort of presentation in the meantime. and then let maybe others join in, because I think everybody will come in their own pace. So we can proceed as soon as you're ready. Yeah.
Okay. I guess we don't have to introduce ourselves because it's just the three of us. But we did our reading on the chapter 1 of the state-directed development, which is the colonial origins of the modern political economy, the Japanese lineage of Korea's cohesive capitalist state. And we decided to focus on what we believe to be the main takeaways of this chapter. I think one of the biggest things that we noticed when we read this is that Japanese colonialism was certainly exploitative, as is colonialism in all of its forms. But Japanese colonialism in Korea at the time allowed for the construction of really, really powerful interventionist state that has now sort of expanded into the modern Korean economy. Japan really left some huge institutional legacies. They helped develop infrastructure, a stable government system, bureaucratic capacity, and really just huge collaboration between the private and public sector. And that coordination between those two really fostered a capitalist sort of state development with long-term sustainable economic growth. In particular, some really big examples of this collaboration between state and non-state actors and sort of the hands-on state building that Japan did in Korea at the time would be the creation of like railway systems, accessible education systems, and more efficient taxing systems as well. It's also really similar, as I previously mentioned, to maybe Singapore and Hong Kong's post-colonial economies. I think for the same reason of post-colonial like state development that reinstated and sort of reused existing colonial frameworks that had been set in place. So instead of scrapping the existing system and coming up with a unique system post independence or like post-colonialism, they were able to sort of refine the system as needed to better suit their context and their situation without fully scrapping the entire system, which I think was, well, we think was incredibly useful for its long-term sustainable growth and is what helped it sustain that growth to modern day now. Also, as we mentioned in our previous chat, it's interesting how much it differs from British colonization, especially when thinking about the Indian context, which was a lot less hands-on, a lot more extractive, super exploitative of the land. Japanese colonialism was far, far more hands-on because the state is so embedded in the economy and because of how much collaboration there was between public and private sectors at the time. They are super, super intertwined as a result of this hands-on approach to colonialism. While I think it's easy to see all of these things and sort of conflate Japan with maybe bureaucratic capacity or the implementation or introduction of good governance systems, and helping Korea at the time like build on and expand their economy to now have this really impressive economic growth every year and be one of the leading, like, you know, higher income countries in the world now. This isn't to say that Japanese colonialism and Japanese imperialism, especially like before and during World War II, was very, very harmful. In no way is it an excuse, like just because they're doing very well economically now, for how the Korean people were treated at the time. All of this economic growth was done under very exploitative conditions. There was a lot of political repression, a lot of very forced labor with poor working conditions, low skilled labor, and essentially this entire system of, you know, state run, I guess not state run, but heavily influenced by the state economy, was built on the pain and suffering and the erasure of Korean culture. So those were the key points that we really touched on. if Mata or Carl have anything else to add, but that's pretty much what we had prepared.
Mhm. Okay. Mhm. Okay. Yeah. I mean, so one interesting point that you made, I think, Mackenzie, which is on not to equate the progress made in economic performance to be confused or conflated with the nature of extractive colonialism that Japan I mean, Japan saw Korea more as a sort of a extension of its own territory, and as a result, the idea of extractive utility was less visible or observed in context to market extraction, the kind of stories or the kind of anecdotes you have from the British experience in Nigeria or partly India for that matter. But you do see a lot of entrenched experience of exploitation of the Korean people at the hands of a very sort of heavily policed state, which is evident in the experience of colonialism under Japan. So that I think is a useful point. In your own experience, I'm just talking about, so Marta and Carl, maybe in your context of understanding from this particular case, what other what other perspectives on colonialism can you in either way relate or not so relate with what you read here? Is there any other experience in context to what you know, which may be of another country or maybe on another context? And how does this sort of enrich in your understanding of colonial institutions or colonial rule?
I could go first. So I know it's not exactly the same situation, but the pattern that I've noticed based on readings is anytime there's kind of like a set form of settler colonialism where the colonials, I don't know if that's the right term, settle on the land and actually try to build up the land to project growth. Later on, that country is left with kind of like a sort of solid base to go off of. I'm trying to think. Australia was a settler colony, I believe. North America was a settler colony, I believe. But most of sub-Saharan Africa didn't have that same experience, which is why we can see kind of like a drastic difference to this day. So those would be like my main comparisons, like the pattern that I noticed and that I saw. And you can even see it with the drastic difference between the development of North and South Korea, if you just even want to compare the difference in institutions that exist in those two areas, which was based off of colonialism as well. So, yeah.
Carl, any thoughts?
For myself, what I can say is like you were saying, I saw when countries see like the colonizators saw the other country like an extension. The base are really more solid than when it's more for profit. By example, we did our project for the case of Cambodia, and there the case was really different because it was really like extracting the resource, and then the country was left like to rebuild itself multiple times after that.
Mhm. Okay, excellent. Thank you, group. And I hope the text was helpful. All right, I see some of you joining back. My apologies, guys. I'm also experimenting with this. Usually what we've done is previously have meeting rooms that were outside the Zoom space, but this was helpful because in your sort of simulation exercise, the breakout rooms thing would work better. So, but what I did was extended the time sort of space a little bit so that you all had enough, I think, bandwidth just to discuss what you were reading through. Some of the texts are a little bit more sort of dense in context to what they sort of cover, encapsulate. The purpose here is for a class activity to get some basic understanding of what the context of the reading is, and then give you more time with it later on. So we've had one group already talking about their reading. I want to sort of go back to now group number. So that was Carl, Marta, and Mackenzie. They've gone in. So group one, Jonathan, Louise, Elisana, if you're here, we could just get started, please, as soon as you're ready.
Okay, so our group discussed the A Tale of Two Dominions reading. So just to generally summarize what that reading discusses, they are looking at the income convergence between Canada and Australia. More specifically, they're looking at how the economy is differentiated going from the 19th century into the 20th century. Specifically, how in the 19th century, the Australian economy was stronger, but then towards the end of the 20th century, the Canadian economy was stronger. So they discuss first how there are similarities between the two countries. Both had small populations compared to their large land resources. They had many exports in their early development, but there was a shift towards industrial and service employment in the 20th century. The big difference that they note is in the development of external trade. Canada, because of the geographical closeness to the United States, started exporting with them more than with Britain, which is what Australia was exporting more to. And they see this as where the big change in the convergence happens. With the proximity to the United States, Canadian institutions and economic policies start to take on more of an American structure compared to the British structure that's seen in Australia. And then with this proximity, there's also larger migration and economic investment into Canada from the US, particularly in the auto industry is the example they give. In terms of institutions, you start to see a transformation in the education system. The Australian system followed more closely with the British one, where this encouraged more workplace training and apprenticeships, where the American education system emphasized the importance of secondary or tertiary education. The model of the government in Australia more closely followed the Britain. They tended to have more restricted policies on their economy that favored sectional interests over those of the general economy. Australia experienced a depression in the 1890s, started by a balance of payments crisis in 1891, and also experienced a cessation in British lending because of the crisis that they were having. And then they go on to discuss changes in the interwar period between World War I and II. So Australia experienced an economic downturn first, but Canada experienced a more severe one starting in around 1917. And I think that was sort of broadly what we discussed.
Okay, excellent. Let me just sort of invite other groups to sort of add insights based on what they were reading. Group 3, do you want to go ahead next, please? Francia, Mary Pat, and you could just mention a little bit about the reading which you were studying. I think this might be the colonialism and development British
Yeah.
India read.
It is. So what we did is we organized it into like key arguments, like 6 key arguments of the reading. And so we'll just sort of go through that and then just kind of sort of go through the main 6 key arguments we find out, and then just a little bit of examples from the readings. So yeah, so it talks about colonialism as mixed with market integration, and let me reorganize my thoughts. One of the key points to start with is that you can see colonialism as a catalyst for market integration and selective development. So the British colonial rule, while it was exploitative in many aspects. It also play a key role in integrating India into the global economy. So that's one argument through market creation, infrastructure, legal reforms. But if it kind of facilitated selective economic growth. So this is when we see in the readings about, the building of the railways, the telegraphs, English commercial law, into that whole market integration process. And also with like major commodities such as the cotton mills and the jute industry, that was all expanded under colonial sort of conditions. But it also created like inequality of development in different regions and other regions. So it made some regions growth, but then it marginalized others. So that takes me to my second point, argument in the reading. So like colonial development produced regional and sectoral inequalities, which, geographically and socially uneven as well, because it was more selective based on regions and industries. And so, for example, the agricultural gains were limited to some regions, like water, land, rail connectivity, and export access. Industrialization, sort of remain agrarian and underdeveloped. And it then sort of overlooked artisan sectors. And the third point was that the British Empire created sort of a legal institutional frameworks that did enable the development of commerce, but it constrained economic development at the same time. So the reforms they can argue that the reforms that the British applied modernized India's economic institutions by sort of introducing like a standardized law, but they also prioritized imperial control and over local agency. So, for instance, the reading mentions the Indian Contract Act in 1872. So property law reforms that enable commerce, but sideline indigenous legal traditions. And in plantations, it was like labor was controlled through harsh contract laws and criminalized breach and undermining labor rights. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Mary Pat, to explain her other 3 points.
Yeah, wonderful. So continuing from what Francia was saying, so under British rule, from what I understood, the new technologies helped India's industries grow. The technologies that the British Empire kind of brought in, but the country stayed dependent on British expertise, which limited the independent industrialization by India and kind of ensured that India kind of stayed dependent on Britain, which, as we learned in the previous classes, that has created a lot of challenges. So then regarding technology, there was a difficult relationship because while India's industries grew because of the new technologies introduced during the colonial rule, the country did stay dependent on Britain for expertise and tools, which could have held back India's ability to industrialize on its own. But over time, as the reading said, there were industries like the cotton mills that developed skills within the country and helped reduce the dependence on the British Empire and the British industries. But it was a very slow process and it took a lot of time and effort to kind of build that skill set back up and have the capital to do that. This was also the case in India's artisanal industry, like textiles. And I enjoyed reading about that because I'm interested in art and all that aspect. So I kind of attached to that idea a bit. And so that had been previously destroyed, it seemed, by Britain's manufacturing industries as well, because Britain the British Empire focused on making as much profit and kind of exploiting as much as they could, but it changed the industries within the country. So it was interesting to read how the artists and the artisanal aspects started to bounce back, as well as the iron trade, which increased too. So there were some changes over time, but it took quite a long time. And then continuing, the British seemed to promote free markets, but blocked Indians from having the political freedom in a lot of ways. And they still made laws that benefited the British interests in exploitation. So, like that, from what I understood, the unfair labor laws and practices continued, even though there were some changes and they were trying to present in a certain way that they were doing things for India, though it seemed to be actually quite exploitative. And so overall, then the chapter really talked about how British colonial rule between the 1860s and 1920s transformed India's economy with the integration of India into the global market. And then, like it said kind of in the introduction, Marxists argued that colonialism led to inequalities and poverty and the underdevelopment in India. But the authors of the article asked for us not to focus only on whether colonialism was beneficial or harmful, but seemed to consider the institutions and technology changes, like the artisanal sector, agriculture, property rights, and how that all facilitated the economic change, either for positive or negative. And so, like we've been talking about, it argues that understanding these processes is quite essential to analyzing the impact of colonialism on development, especially in India. Thanks.
That's excellent, guys. I know this one is not an easy text to absorb because it changes a lot of tracks. So I appreciate in the limited time we all had to unpack so many layers. Maripat, since you mentioned a little bit about the sort of artisanal handlooms and crafts interest, this connected reading, I've just shared a link. You should get to a library, a database, Routledge text there. And for others who might be, because a lot of the current handloom and textile industry, that's an area which I also do a lot of research work in, embedded crafts. One of our project clusters looks at local embedded knowledge systems, basically how cultural aspects of vocational traditions of craft has nurtured across generations within certain communities. And a lot of that has to go back into the nature of changes that were brought in design and production patterns and crafts and artisan work during the colonial era. Surprisingly, for a lot of people who, I mean, the sort of larger dominant Marxist interpretation is that the British induction sort of completely took the craft mechanism away from the cycles of, I mean, I would say work or production that was there in the pre-colonial period or the pre-British colonial period. But I mean, Roy's work here, who is sort of taken a very, I wouldn't say non-Marxist position, but one where it sees colonialism as a process of bringing, as you said, institutional and technological change. It tries to study how the markets for artisanal communities changed after for post 1860. So the pre-1860 period is very different. So I'll talk a little bit about this when we get into India, which is sort of our main focus point from here on. But thank you for that, and Francia as well for that excellent introduction. Group 3, if I'm correct. Sorry, group 4, if I'm correct. This would be Asia, if I'm correct, Charlie, Laura. So
So that was our group. We were looking at Korea's colonial and post-colonial past. So some things that I'll kind of highlight is what Korea was like before kind of the Japanese intervened. So they're they're actually kind of modeled a bit after China. They had a lot of Chinese influence in their like culture and stuff like that. They had a stable rule, but they kind of had a corrupt elite in that the elites were collecting a lot of money from the peasantry, but they weren't really providing any services. So there was a lot of resistance towards the elites from the peasantry. And because the elites had, you know, all these resources, all this power, they weren't really investing anything back into the society. So very little kind of development progress while these elites were in power. And yeah. And then Japan was rising kind of as a power after they won a war with Russia. And so when they came into Korea, they were able to disband or defeat their military pretty easily. And one kind of difference we see with Japan going into Korea compared to other kind of colonial relationships is that Japanese elites were still pretty integrated into Korea. So like one of the first major things they did was really build their police force on the ground. And so the police force bloomed like to quite a large extent, which solved one problem that Korea had before, which is that they didn't really, like, they were having trouble with taxation and stuff like that. They didn't really know, like, they didn't really map their country very well. They didn't know what, you know, resources people had and stuff like that. So when the Japanese took over, they had a really large police force, which helped with kind of this mapping process. And so in the military, like other industries that bloomed, there was lots of Korean people like employed in these industries, but they were typically at lower level careers, whereas the Japanese would come in to kind of fill all these like executive roles. So unlike other kind of colonial examples, the Japanese were very heavily integrated, and I think the intention was more or less for Korea to be an extension of Japan as opposed to like a separate kind of country where they just kind of took all the resources. They did want to kind of build up Japan or build up Korea, build up their manufacturing because they wanted like Japanese people to migrate there.
Great. And I can just follow up to what Laura said. It was interesting to look at the Japanese imperial model, which is different than, for example, the British and the Portuguese in India, because it was a neighboring state, and the implications of sharing, you know, racial and cultural traits. And the Japanese ended up having a very direct and integrated approach to colonization versus, you know, some of the other examples that we have. And this in turn integrated the elite classes through education and development into the structure of the government. And so many of the Koreans were part of actually revitalizing and developing Korea, which I think was definitely something that benefited not only the imperial machine, but also Korea. It was interesting to see, you know, the authoritarian rule, of course, that existed, because certainly I think there's the paper mentions, you know, compared to the British hold on some of the landowners. So that was, you know, very different in the India model. But at the same time, you know, post-colonialism, post-colonization, of course, you see the same impact on the workers in the end. Before they were, you know, sort of having to deal with the agriculture, you know, sector, but later on employed in those factories. And, you know, the actual impact on the workers, you know, and what it meant in terms of inequity in the actual structure of colonization. And of course, we don't have a lot of data on that. So we can only imagine what that impact of working in industry 12 hours a day. And right, and so that sort of is, you know, one of the common themes. And we did, Laura was in my group, and we did Indonesia, and so I had done a little bit on the colonial experience, and so saw some similarities there as well. That in the end, you know, it's always, you know, the people who are actually doing the work and the impact on them compared to the elites who find it so, you know, beneficial and much easier to integrate into the imperial structure. Thank you.
So I guess I will just sort of finally summarize by saying, the unique experience that Korea had under Japanese colonialism. Although there were many benefits in building up industry and allowed, it talks about allows Korea, once post colonization to really take off. The structure is inherently designed to benefit the Japanese, colonialist. It was designed. They were very heavy on making sure that the Korea was an export state. They were very good at promoting natural resources, such as Korea's ability to build up, to use, to develop rice, but also very careful to make sure that that was mostly exported out for the use of the Japanese, especially when Japan reached a stage where they were requiring that extra materials. So it was not, while the Japanese colonization did ultimately have benefits for Korea in many ways for industrializing, it was not inherently designed as a fully pro-Korea approach. It was designed as a pro-Japanese with certain benefits that were then given to Korea through that search for Japanese material benefit.
So one of the interesting things, because we had a long conversation before all groups were coming in with another group which was looking at the same text. So what this text doesn't do is sort of talk about the socio-cultural shifts drawn from the impact of Japanese colonialism on Korea at large, because Japan saw Korea as an extended territory of itself, which is very different from the extractive nature of colonial institutions developed in, let's say, under the British Empire in Nigeria or India for that matter. So there's the tinkering in terms of the change of the colonial rule is very integral. So while you see a lot of embedded industrial policy frameworks that Japan as a state was entrenching in its own state society compact, it saw Korea as pretty much part of the same experiment, and that in fact led to a heavy exploitation of the workforce in the Korean context, which was done through, in some cases, through extreme torture and exploitation. And that aspect, I think, somehow is while it is not discussed in this particular chapter, Kohli talks about it somewhere in the second and the third chapter in Korean context, but it has lingering effects of the nature of change that, in a socio-cultural sense, Korea saw, and what it experienced even during the sort of its own civil war right after the decolonization process was initiated. So it's a very, it's a different perspective, but at the same time, there's a lot in it which, while the text may not say, is I think of equal, if not less, of importance to engage. But let me just sort of invite the last group to share their reflections of what they would have come across. Des, your team, please. I think it was
yes,
Des.
yeah. We basically discussed also the British India colonialism and development reading. And some of the key takeaways that we got from it was British rule certainly caused harm and exploitation to India, but at the same time, it also brought new institutions, trade opportunities, infrastructure to the country. For one, infrastructure, they did help develop the railways, ports, in order for India to be connected to the global market. Indian artisans and craft workers survived by learning new techniques in handloom, weaving, and leatherwork. But at the same time, the exploitation or harm that was caused by the colonialization was in terms of land ownership. There was a decision to privilege ownership of land over user rights. And this was, I think the text mentioned the zamindari system. It made the tax revenue a legal contractual matter rather than a political one. It privilege the owners like in a parasitic relationship with the peasants, as they were living off rents while the peasants were falling into debt, to a debt trap by constantly having to borrow money, which left them little for land or technological improvement. So there was like a pros and cons that were presented in the text on how India was colonized and its results to their country. And I think Steph would be adding more points from our discussion.
Yeah, there's I think two more points that we talked about as a group. The scientific development in India being a political process. How, like, first off, mostly the technological spillover was from the British know-how, in terms of their natural resources, the how India managed their capital, their labor laws, were all kind of heavily influenced by the British. But as time went on, the text kind of made it seem that like the diffusion of technologies only kind of receive sponsorship if the knowledge systems concerned were useful to the imperialists in question, which put India behind. And then also the text mentioned a little bit of like a Marxist perspective on how foreign trade was sort of forced on risk-averse peasants, and the gains from such trade were dissipated in rent, were dissipated in interests, and were dissipated in various taxes. And the interest that India paid on their British debt was a significant drain on potential public investment funds. So to sum up our conversation, we kind of concluded that some parts of India benefited, but mostly as a whole they didn't, because growth was only concentrated on a few urban areas, and those who really benefited were the wealthy entrepreneurs rather than the lower levels.
So it's interesting because on entrepreneurs you will find the following text talks about the distinction between European entrepreneurs investing in the Indian subcontinent versus indigenous or sort of native entrepreneurs. And the 1920 period onwards sees this distinction because of the First World War. Massive investment of capital that was coming into the Indian subcontinent stops or starts sort of waning. And as a result, there's a lot of dependence or interdependence between Bombay, Calcutta and Madras, but mostly Bombay-based businesses. And in fact, that network becomes extremely important in funding a lot of capital investment needs. Now, interestingly, what happens is that those merchants become also the main primary funders for the Congress, that is the Indian nationalist movement that goes for the independence period, which is also happening. The churn is also happening around the same time. So the Bombay Club, which was famously called as the group of merchants which were engaged, they became, and the Parsis were very much important in this regard, the Parsi community in the Indian context, what we often sort of in reflection talk about as the Tatas. And so these groups which gained significantly from investment of capital and returns, let's say in the late 19th century, and with the war and Britain's sort of relative weakening of international position, European capital drying out, Indian businesses started to invest. And by this, I mean, you had businesses from all over, but largely the concentration of wealth started increasing in areas around some of the port areas like Bombay, Karachi and others. And this became the main sort of channel of mobilization of capital for the Congress party, which was the main opposition party fueling the nationalist movement for independence, to get support from these communities. Because up until then, there was no capital support that these political parties had. And one of the larger reasons was because the merchant community was not that well endowed with capital and money. So with that, maybe that we'll sort of talk about this as well as we move on. So thank you so much. I mean, I know what we tried to do today was to, I mean, enable two things. I wanted to interact or let you interact with, each other, I think, to be able to discuss thoughts on text that you're reading. I think for some, it's important because since it's not an in-person sort of a class, a lot of times discussions tend to happen based on what I'm saying and I'm speaking, and the disposition of that is varied from my own sort of intellectual, bias towards one or two or three disciplines at large. But sometimes when each one of you coming from a different disciplinary background would look at a text, you'd have different interest points. I think it's important to look at that, take a look at that. The other point is that when you're looking at texts which are slightly deferred to the sort of space of interest or zone of interest for you, I think what you could do is pick up aspects that you found more interesting and then try to sort of know a little bit more around those verticals, because that's the point here is to sort of enable a more in-depth reading of those aspects which are of interest, at the same time which can help you expand or widen the horizon of sort of knowing in that space. I want to mention 2 or 3 things that will be of very critical importance in our next sort of coming weeks class, at least deliberations. And I think it might be useful if you've looked at some of these reading references at least once in advance, because there will be some sections we will discuss in class, but it would be helpful if you have gone through. So I'm just pulling the course manual out here to just give you a sense. Oh, I can see the share option. Yeah, sorry. Mhm. Yeah, so if you would, I mean, from the sort of manual itself, if you would see a set of topics that are shared, yeah. So, I mean, for some of you, you have looked at the colonialism and development text. So, I mean, there's a lot to go back in the Indian colonial history. I don't want to sort of make this entire discussion centric only to the colonial narrative, because there's also a lot of different period. 1860 and prior is East India rule in much of the subcontinent, and that's a very different pattern of rule, which is extremely dependent on tax revenue, federal policy structures, and less focused on the points that were being said by those looking at the text today. The constitution of the imperial design of the British project in India was based on 3 components of the imperial umbrella: law, language, and knowledge. This is what the author sort of speaks about, but I think it's very interesting to look at the nature of changes brought in law. Language as is more sort of the hegemonic institutionalization of English in the language of administrative communication. It's still pretty much it is the case. In fact, as we speak right now, there's a huge linguistic battle in the Indian context between the southern and the northern states in terms of the sort of legitimizing of English in the language of communication from Delhi with much of the southern states, where the only language of communication between these states was English always, which was a barrier in the past. So that is an extension of a practice which was there or instituted by the British, but simply for governance purposes. The third vertical on knowledge, I think, is very interesting because of the kind of scientific developments that the British were invested in the Indian subcontinent at large for extractive utility of gains for medicine, botanical sort of flora and fauna purposes. But a lot of those institutional changes happened. The whole movement around Orientalism, which is well sort of explained in history, is all connected with that sort of process. The other text, which is on depression and decolonization, I don't think a lot of people have either written or written in context to India around this period of time, which is explaining what was happening to Britain's international sort of position, but what was happening within India in context to the nature of change in industrial policy, growth, market integration, but allowing Indian businesses to do more or less much better. So these two texts, for those who have not, I think, taken a look or maybe don't know much about the Indian context, it might be helpful for you to sort of read this in a current context, because I know some of you who may be more interested in going from a very present to past perspective may find this to be of more help. Is a two-part, I think, EPW commentary on the politics of economic growth in India in the last sort of 2 or 3 decades. And it's perhaps, I think, one of the few texts that talk about the state perspective as well. So the reason I'm mentioning about these texts are that anecdotally, while we may talk about some of these issues in the class, it may be helpful if you have some basic awareness of the text at large, to whatever extent you understand. I think sometimes the use of methodological concentration, use of numbers, data, or models that don't get too sort of overwhelmed or intimidated by that. The fact is, you want to just sort of look at the context of the introductory aspects of the reading, get the perspective of what the author is saying, a few notes of what your understanding of his or her arguments are, and then we can have a discussion of that in class. Yes, Francia, please go ahead.
Hi, Professor. I like to use the last few minutes to discuss something of importance, and is the upcoming assignments that we have. And
Yes,
so
please.
I'd like to raise a concern that about time management and workload. We had our first group presentation last week. We have a chapter review due next Wednesday, the 2 chapter reviews. Then we have another group work on the virtual policy group work. And then that is on the July 31st, due on July 31st. And then on August 3rd, we have the final assignment book review. So and then I hear about the virtual policy group work. Group work is really hard to coordinate. It's very intensive as well. And so I'd like to see my peers' opinions on that, or thoughts on that too, and to see how we can make this a little bit more manageable. Because personally, I feel that this 4 assignments is something, and 2 group work assignments included, something that we see over the term of a whole term semester, but this is in 1 month. And I find that it is a little bit of a big load. And so how can we make this more manageable? And see if you can help us.
So I'll respond to it, Francis, if you allow me. The only group assignment you're looking at now is your policy simulation exercise. You're done with your presentation, right? Yes, if I'm
We did, but there's 2 group assignments in 1 month, which is really hard to, and you mentioned that you were going to talk to us about the virtual policy assignment the week, like just give it us 1 week from when it's due. And I think that's very short.
No. So what do you want? So again, I'm just clarifying. There is only 1 group assignment that you have after this, which is your virtual exercise, which is what I'm trying to clarify. There is no other group assignment. Today, what we did was a sort of an in-class activity, because I feel sometimes it's good for class participants also to interact amongst what they're reading, because everybody's coming from very diverse reading background. So
Oh,
it's not.
so the virtual policy assignment that is due on July 31st, based on the is that not a group assignment?
So that's the only group assignment which I'm saying that you have next. There's nothing else. Everything else is individual, which is, I mean, the book that everybody is reviewing, the chapter review is from the same book. The final book review submission is 5th of August. It's due on 5th of August, not the 3rd. I clarified this 2 classes back. So your official exam period is 5th to 7th. I think that's something which the department had informed me much later, but I corrected it right away.
Okay. Yeah. So I know what you mean that by next group assignment, but what I'm saying is I'm taking the whole view from the beginning of July until the 5th of August. That's just 2 group assignments in 1 month. Counting the one we just did. Yeah.
I am constrained. I would rather phase this out. I mean, when I teach a course, maybe let's say at any other institution, you would have a term time of maybe 8 to 10 weeks, right? Which would give you a lot of space to plan things across the board. So the way I had put intervals was there were around 2 weeks roughly of intervals between all submissions, more or less. It's only in the case of the last policy simulation that you're doing on the 31st, and between that and your end term book review. And I had mentioned how to plan this, which is that you start approaching the review of, don't wait till the last 2 weeks to have the book review submission completely aggregated for writing, because of course you're reviewing a text by reading a book. The sooner you start doing that, I think you'll be in a better place to submit it. But in terms of coordination or extensive presence of, I think, mine for an evaluative purpose, the only thing you're doing with the simulation is between what, 20, if I'm correct, 24th to 31st, because you'll know the details about the simulation around the 24th, and then you have a week's time as a group to work together. And that's the nature of the evaluation of that particular exercise. And as I said, you don't know anything much about it at this point of time. So mostly what we can do is to focus on the text you're reviewing, any book that you've identified to be able to review, and you could start sort of looking at that. But I mean, in terms of timelines of what you're saying is that, oh, July has a month which has 2 submissions. The challenge of that is because of the fact that you have an entire course being taught in a period of 6 weeks. So June is when you're starting off. You can't keep an assignment in week 1 or week 2 fairly, because you're setting the foundations of the course. And evaluations have to be multiple in nature, because then if you put too much of weight on evaluation on 1 or 2, not everybody's skill set is in writing, or, you know, let's say even group work for that matter. So you need some diversified representation. But happy to talk about this if there's.
Yeah, I think my argument is that it's 2 group assignments in 6 weeks, which is completely strenuous. But could we, as a result or a result solution, could we get the groups for the virtual policy due either on the next class or the 17th, the latest, so that we know who we're working with?
With the simulation, you mean that's something that you would want? And if everybody
Yes.
wants, fine. So you can have everything about the, so there's a small caveat I must add. If after that, if everybody votes for this, that's completely okay. The point is, once you know every detail about the simulation, your work starts pretty much right then. And sometimes, given the amount of time you would have between knowing what the simulation is, I mean, simulation is a role play exercise where the time interval is based from the time it is announced. So from the time it is announced till the time you are sort of doing or getting to the end of the simulation, the entirety of that is counted. So if everybody's okay with that, I'm completely fine. I can share with you all the details, all your respective group details. In fact, I don't need to wait till even the 17th. I can share with you as early as the 15th itself. So you'll have maybe what, 15, 16 days.
That would be
Um,
wonderful. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I can share with this information with you by tomorrow if you need it. That's not an concern. But with simulation, actually, what happens is we generally want you to have time concentrated towards the last week, because there are a lot of other things we are doing in class. Sometimes the attention of what is being covered in class gets affected. But I mean, I trust everyone to sort of manage this if that's the direction which everybody wants to go. So we could, I mean, I'm just inviting thoughts from others. If you want me to share details of your policy simulation exercise at an earlier date, we can take sort of a vote on that, and that's fine. For book review and other things, those details were shared as early as week 1. I mean, assignments, I had shared actually all information in, I think if I'm correct, by the second class of week 1. So my sense was that everybody was aware what we are doing when, but if the time can be shortened, and so others, you have to say anything before we close for today, and I can
I think
yes, John.
I think everything was clear in terms of assignment and all that. The concern is more on the workload, as Francia mentioned. Mostly of us are working, taking more than one classes, so that's where the concept comes from. But yeah, if yeah, that's yeah.
No, I understand, but I'm also required, because of the administrative nature of how in summer courses are, credits and other things. So I looked at 3 courses before this was being designed, on how evaluations were being done. So I cannot remove an assignment. Of course, that may not happen at this. What I can definitely do is, if you need information on something earlier than that, what was being earlier provided, that I can do. And I think it's up to the, I mean, we have to manage with what we have to manage. Let me put it that way. But I would definitely suggest, it's for me as from a teaching standpoint as well. I mean, if a course is spread out between 8 to 10 weeks, it's much at least 8 weeks, if not 10. It's much easier with a course such as this, because there's just a lot of ground you're covering, and it is unfair to I think limit the scope of the course, because you do want to know and understand background contexts as much as one can. But I'm just looking at the dates of what we can probably offer.
Yeah, I guess
So
the best option would be to just have more info regarding the next group activity.
I'm
Yeah.
just taking a vote.
Yeah, that's what he's mentioning right now, Jonathan. So he would like to share with us the details of the virtual policy, the next group assignment, which we don't have, because we do have the book review and the chapter review details. We're just missing the virtual policy group assignment next. But he's proposing that if we want to have him share it with us on the 15th of earlier, those details that he can. He just want to see a show of hands or a vote for that, if you guys would rather have that.
One thing I need to clarify, I mentioned while explaining, the policy simulation exercise is not the same as a virtual presentation exercise. Your simulation exercise starts from the date is declared, which is why the longer the period you have, the more time that you get, the greater is the expectation of what you're doing with the assignment. So generally speaking, I keep this concentrated in a week, because you're fine doing this in a week, and that's okay. But if there is if there is a group, generally a class consensus that no, we are happy knowing about the assignment as early as, let's say, 15th, and you need 15 days. It's not just about having the time to manage. I understand that as well, but the simulation is, the nature of the evaluation is such that moment it is announced, like the moment I announce this, your simulation exercise, the clock starts from there on. So
And
that's
we cannot
completely
make concessions about that. Like we cannot make concessions about that.
concessions about what? Declaring
About
it in
Yeah, because basically, if I
No,
understand that you're saying that the moment you announce the details of how it is done is due the following week. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just trying to
But-
understand it.
No, but which is what I'm saying. No, but that's how the simulation is. I mean, not many of you would have done sims before. Or if those who have would know this, it works in a certain clock pattern. But as I said, I can release the details for everybody as a team to know about the simulation as early as tomorrow. I don't even have to wait till the 15th. But you just need to be aware that a simulation exercise, once the details are shared, the expectation is with the nature of the evaluation that you start working on it from that period on. So if everybody is okay with that, I can share this right away. That's not an issue.
So,
Yes.
I think I understand what you're saying, Professor Mohan. So that will probably, releasing all of the information will probably not work in our favor then. I think, that is my understanding. If the clock starts ticking at that moment, that means the probably, not knowing what the assignment is, but the scope of the work will probably get bigger. And so that may, yes, so I don't think so on that basis. I personally don't want it released. I think what Francia was talking about in the beginning was the amount of assignments that are coming in towards the end, which are going to be now 3 or at least 2, including the book review. I understand the August 3rd is the due date. Since we can't really 5th?
It is.
Okay. All right, so I think the first is a Friday, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. So it is due on the Tuesday, is what you're saying, August the 5th. Okay, all right. So I think the consensus, and it's we had a similar discussion in our group too about the workload. I think given that people have summer employment, it's just been hard to juggle everything. But I also understand that in terms of, even the written assignments, you're constrained by the evaluation structure and won't be able to change much at this point.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of all on the same page with you guys, which is why, I mean, when we were discussing the evaluation for the chapter review, I think the date for the chapter review submission is when? You would know by now that
It's
I
the
think
7th. It's next Wednesday, which feels quite soon considering we actually did end up finishing one on the 6th. Yeah.
you see the assignment is declared as early as week 1. I mentioned this then that
I
since
know.
Evaluative deadlines closing in the end of July and the first week of August is your exam. The term period for end term evaluation is a narrow window between 5th and 6th, I think, of August. That's what the department mentioned. So these summer courses are always tight. I think that's the way the nature of summer courses are. They're heavy, they're extensive, and people are doing this for all sort of different reasons. So my sense is at this point of time, if you were to follow what you've been doing and just focus on doing your chapter review and end-term book review at the earliest, you're pretty much okay, because the only evaluation you're doing in a more time-sensitive clock is the simulation exercise. But what I will do is, for the benefit of everyone, is that I'll release the simulation exercise details. And your clock can start as and when you guys want to work on it. But if the objective here is just to know the details of the evaluation and be just less concerned or less anxious about what it is going to be, and I understand the anxiety, it's not just you. The simulations have been happening for last 13 years of me teaching. So it's everybody gets anxious with simulations. It's part of the process because you don't know the details. And the whole idea is not to know the details and work as a team, I think, in the last that 1 week. But if you want, I can share these details, let's say by the next class, 15th itself, you can know. And I think you take a vote on this and tell me. I think everybody has different views on this. So
Yes, I think we should do a vote because everyone is feeling differently.
Yeah, just take a vote. I have no, so others can just weigh in. So releasing the evaluation details for your policy simulation on the 24th, which is what it was planned earlier. So, I mean, maybe votes for that, and then versus votes for releasing it 15th. So let me just probably get everybody's views on this. There are 15 people, by the way, and the overall class has like 21. So, okay, so you can just raise your hand on the virtual thing because I know it better. All right, so that is for those who are saying, okay, just release it as it was earlier being announced. How many amongst you? Okay, so 2 votes. How many amongst you would like the evaluation details of the policy simulation to be shared by the 15th of July, which is Tuesday? You can just raise your hands for that now. And for others, you can just sort of turn off or reduce your hands. Okay, so clearly there is a natural consensus of more people being interested. And some people, to them, it doesn't matter if it's released or not. So I'll go with the higher number of votes. So I'll share with you all the details of the simulation exercise by the 15th, which is your Tuesday class. I'll be happy to talk about the simulation in the class as well. Okay. But you can start working in teams and as groups based on your convenience and time. But the deadline and the evaluation exercise will happen on the 31st. Is that okay? Is that fine?
That sounds good.
That sounds fine. Francia, is that okay? 15th is fine, right? Yeah. So I'll release this on the yeah. Okay. But my apologies, guys. I would have been able to correct and reduce any evaluation if this was something we had discussed in week 1 or maximum by week 2. We are now somewhere, I think, so much in the middle of the course that just eliminating an evaluation doesn't make a lot of sense. But if that's the direction you want to move, I mean, we take a look at that as well. I mean, one option is I can mention of this is that the chapter review, if you think that the chapter review submission is overbearing and you just want to do an end-term book review, then that particular grade would get merged. So that's a lot of things waiting in for the end-term book review, right? If you don't do a chapter review, a lot of students have not written, I believe, a lot of times any review assignment. They require feedback on writing, and so that's why we had designated this that way. So I'll release the policy simulation details by the 15th, but let's keep rest of the structure as the way it is. I hope we are in peace with that, right? Can you just give me a thumbs up or anything that just to validate that this is okay? So that we are on the same page. Okay, all right. So details will be all shared and plan, I think, things accordingly and let me know if there's any problem. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye. Yes, EVT आप recording रोक सकते हैं EVT